Her billionaire husband took his mistress to church. She prayed once, then left his life. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The day Grant Whitaker brought another woman into the house of God, Naomi did not raise her voice. She lowered her head, and that silence became the loudest sermon anyone in that church had ever heard. Sunday morning in Charleston had arrived soft and golden, with sunlight spilling over the cobblestone streets and church bells rolling through the historic district like a memory too sacred to touch. Naomi Whitaker stood before the mirror in her quiet bedroom, smoothing the front of her simple white dress with hands that did not tremble yet. The dress was not expensive, not compared to the gowns Grant had bought her for charity galas and hotel openings. But it was the one she wore whenever she needed to remember who she had been before wealth, before marble floors, before cameras, before the lonely echo of being a billionaire's wife in a mansion where love had slowly stopped speaking. At 34, Naomi carried beauty the way some women carried perfume, softly, without asking anyone to notice. Her deep brown skin glowed beneath the morning light, her dark curls pinned back with a pearl clip her late mother had once worn to choir practice. On her left hand, her wedding ring caught a thin blade of sunlight. 9 years. 9 years since she had stood in the front of Grace Covenant Church and promised to love Grant Whitaker through storms, success, sickness, and the kind of silence that marriage counselors never warned about. She had believed every word. She had believed him. Downstairs, the house staff moved quietly through the Whitaker estate, a white-columned mansion overlooking the harbor, but Grant was already gone. His side of the bed had been cold when Naomi woke. There had been no kiss on her forehead, no low voice saying, "I'll meet you there, sweetheart." Only the faint scent of his cologne on the empty pillow and the kind of absence that had become too familiar to keep excusing. Still, Naomi went to church. Not because she was naive. Not because she did not feel the distance. She went because faith had been hers before Grant, and it would remain hers after whatever truth was waiting for her. Grace Covenant was full by the time she arrived. The old brick building breathed history through its stained glass windows, its polished pews, its oak doors worn smooth by generations of hands carrying grief, gratitude, and hope. People turned when Naomi entered, some smiling with the careful warmth reserved for a woman everyone admired but few truly knew. She walked to the front pew, the same pew where she and Grant had sat since their wedding day, and placed her Bible beside her. The choir began to hum. The organist touched the first notes of a hymn. Then the doors opened. Naomi did not turn at first. She knew the rhythm of Grant's footsteps, measured and confident, the sound of a man accustomed to being welcomed everywhere. But the whisper that moved through the sanctuary was not the whisper people made for a late husband. It was sharper, colder, curious. Naomi lifted her eyes. Grant stood beneath the archway in a navy suit tailored to perfection, his silver blonde hair brushed back, his public smile polished and calm. Beside him stood Marissa Vane, elegant in a cream dress, one gloved hand resting lightly on his arm, as though she had earned the right to touch what Naomi had prayed over for nearly a decade. The church seemed to lose its breath. Pastor Raymond froze near the pulpit. An usher looked down at the floor. Marissa's smile was small, controlled, almost victorious. Grant did not remove her hand. He did not explain. He did not look ashamed. He simply walked forward with her, past the people who had watched him marry Naomi, past the women Naomi had helped through hospital bills and grocery drives, past the children she had taught to sing Amazing Grace, and stopped at the Whitaker family pew. Naomi's pew. Their pew. Marissa sat first. Grant sat beside her, and only then did he look at his wife. Not with apology, not with fear, with a warning, a silent command not to embarrass him. Something inside Naomi became very still. Pain came, yes, but not as fire. It came as winter. Clean, white, final. She looked at the man she had loved, then at the woman he had brought into a sacred place to make humiliation look respectable, and she understood what her heart had been trying to tell her for months. Betrayal did not always arrive in darkness. Sometimes it walked into church dressed beautifully and expected the wounded woman to keep singing. The congregation rose for prayer. Naomi rose with them. Her fingers rested on the open pages of her Bible. She closed her eyes, and for one quiet moment, she did not ask God to save her marriage. She did not ask for Grant to change. She did not ask for Marissa to be exposed, or for the room to understand her pain. She asked for peace strong enough to leave without hatred. She asked for dignity steady enough to walk away without breaking. When the prayer ended, the choir began to sing, voices trembling into the high ceiling. Naomi opened her eyes. Slowly, she slipped the wedding ring from her finger. It resisted for a second, as if 9 years of promises still had weight. Then it came free. She placed it on top of her Bible, right where the sunlight touched the page. No speech, no tears, no scene, just a circle of gold left behind in the house where she had once promised forever. Then Naomi Whitaker stepped into the aisle, lifted her chin, and walked toward the open doors while every whisper in the church fell silent behind her. Naomi did not remember the drive away from Grace Covenant in full sentences. She remembered pieces. The blur of live oaks along Meeting Street. The pale flash of church windows shrinking in the rearview mirror. The careful way Aunt Celeste kept both hands on the steering wheel, as if one sudden word might shatter the fragile calm sitting between them. Naomi sat in the passenger seat with her bare left hand folded over her Bible, feeling the strange lightness where her wedding ring had been. Charleston moved around them like any other. Sunday. Families crossed sidewalks in polished shoes. Children tugged at their mothers' hands. A man in a seersucker jacket laughed outside a bakery, carrying a white paper box tied with string. The world had not stopped. That was the first cruelty of heartbreak. Everything kept moving as if a woman's life had not split open beneath a stained glass window. Aunt Celeste drove 3 miles without speaking. Then, in her low, steady voice, she said, "Baby, faith is not a cage." Naomi turned her face toward the window, where sunlight trembled over the harbor. She did not cry. Not yet. "I thought if I stayed gentle long enough, he would remember how to be kind," she whispered. Aunt Celeste's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "Kindness is holy, Naomi. But letting someone make a habit of dishonoring you is not love. It is slow erasure." Those words settled deep, touching places Naomi had not allowed herself to name. For months, she had made excuses for Grant's distance. Board meetings, hotel launches, investor dinners in Atlanta, Miami, and New York. She had told herself that powerful men carried heavy burdens. She had told herself that marriage had seasons. She had told herself that loneliness inside a mansion was still better than giving up on vows spoken before God. But as the car crossed the bridge toward Aunt Celeste's modest house in North Charleston, Naomi finally let the truth stand without decoration. Grant had not drifted. He had chosen. And what hurt most was not only that he had chosen Marissa, but that he had expected Naomi to protect his image while he broke her heart in public. When they arrived, Aunt Celeste unlocked the blue front door and led Naomi inside. The house smelled of lemon polish, coffee, and cornbread cooling on the counter. It was smaller than any room in the Whitaker estate, yet it held more peace than all 18 rooms Grant owned. Naomi placed her Bible on the kitchen table. For a long moment, both women looked at the empty space on top of it where the ring should have been. Then Naomi reached into her purse and took out her phone. There were already 7 missed calls from Grant, 2 from his assistant, and 1 message from an unknown number that she knew, somehow, belonged to Marissa. She turned the phone off. The silence that followed was not weakness. It was the first boundary she had drawn in years. By noon, the news had begun traveling through Charleston's quiet circles. Not in headlines yet, but in whispers. A billionaire. His wife. Another woman. In church. Grant Whitaker had built hotels tall enough to touch clouds and bought entire city blocks with a signature. But even he could not purchase silence from people who had watched humiliation unfold in a sacred room. At the Whitaker estate, Grant returned alone, though he had not planned to. Marissa had gone to a spa appointment, irritated that Naomi had made things dramatic by leaving. Grant stepped into the foyer, where a 20-foot chandelier spilled light over Italian marble, and for the first time, the house did not feel impressive. It felt staged, empty, too clean. He removed his jacket and looked toward the grand staircase. Expecting to hear Naomi's voice calling down with some gentle reminder, he had always pretended not to need. There was nothing. In the sitting room, the piano remained open from the night before. Sheet music rested where Naomi had left it, marked with pencil notes for the children's choir. On the side table sat a stack of handwritten cards she had prepared for hospital volunteers. Her presence was everywhere, not loud, not demanding, but woven into the life of the house like thread holding fabric together. Grant picked up one card and read the first line. "Thank you for making someone feel seen." His jaw tightened. For years, he had mistaken Naomi's quiet labor for softness, her grace for permission, her forgiveness for something endless. He had believed power meant having the room adjust to his mistakes. But that afternoon, standing in a mansion filled with everything money could buy and nothing that could comfort him, Grant Whitaker began to understand that a woman who leaves without screaming may have already survived the loudest part of her pain. By late afternoon, Naomi's silence had become something Grant could not control. He called again at 2:17, then 2:43, then 3:05, each unanswered ring, turning his confidence thinner than the last. At first, he told himself she only needed time to calm down. By 4 o'clock, he began drafting explanations in his head, polished sentences fit for boardrooms and reporters, words like misunderstanding, overreaction, complicated, and private matter. None of them sounded like the truth. Across town, Naomi sat at Aunt Celeste's kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, writing down the things she needed to do before grief could convince her to stay. Call attorney. Freeze joint social calendar. Forward foundation contacts. Pack personal documents. She wrote each line slowly, her handwriting elegant and steady, the way it had been when she signed thank you cards for Grant's donors, birthday notes for his employees, and sympathy letters to families she barely knew but always found time to comfort. Aunt Celeste placed a mug of tea beside her and said nothing. That was love, Naomi thought. Not pressure, not performance. Presence. At 5:30, Pastor Raymond Ellis arrived in his gray Sunday suit, his Bible tucked under one arm and sorrow carved gently into his face. He had married Naomi and Grant beneath the stained glass window of Grace Covenant 9 years earlier. He had watched Grant cry that day, watched the young billionaire promise before God and family that Naomi would never have to question her place in his life. Now the old pastor stood in Aunt Celeste's doorway, as if carrying the weight of every vow he had ever witnessed. "I am sorry, child," he said. Naomi invited him in, and for a moment, the three of them sat in the soft kitchen light while cicadas hummed outside. Pastor Raymond did not tell her to go back. He did not wrap pain in pretty scripture or ask her to protect the reputation of a man who had not protected her heart. Instead, he folded his hands and said, "A covenant is not a stage where one person performs loyalty while the other practices betrayal." Naomi looked down at her bare finger, and the first tear finally came. It slipped quietly over her cheek, not wild, not helpless, only honest. "I prayed for peace," she whispered, "and the answer was to leave." Pastor Raymond nodded. "Then let peace finish what? It started." That evening, Naomi returned to the Whitaker estate with Aunt Celeste waiting in the car. She did not enter through the front door like the lady of the house. She used the side entrance near the garden, the one she had always preferred because the jasmine grew thick there and reminded her of her mother's backyard in Savannah. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of Grant speaking on the phone in his office. His voice carried through the hallway, controlled but strained. "This cannot become a story," he said. "Handle the church board. Handle the donors. And find out where my wife is." Naomi paused at the word wife. How easily he used it when possession mattered. How rarely he had honored it when love required humility. She climbed the stairs and packed only what was hers before marriage. Her mother's pearl clip, a box of choir photographs, 3 journals, the worn Bible from her college years, a navy sweater Grant had never noticed but Aunt Celeste had knitted by hand. She left behind the diamonds, the designer gowns, the handbags locked in glass cabinets like museum pieces. They had never been proof of love. They were receipts for absence. In the bedroom, she opened the drawer of her nightstand and found an old photograph from their first year together. Grant stood beside her at a community food drive, sleeves rolled up, laughing as Naomi handed canned peaches to a little boy with missing front teeth. That man had once seemed real. Maybe he had been. Maybe wealth had not changed him as much as it had revealed what he worshipped most. Naomi placed the photograph on the bed and set her house key beside it. When she turned to leave, Grant stood in the doorway. For the first time that day, his face had no rehearsed expression. His eyes moved from the small suitcase in her hand to the key on the bed. "Naomi," he said softly, as if softness could undo public shame. She met his gaze with a calm that cost her everything. "You brought her to the place where we made our vows." Grant swallowed. "I made a mistake." Naomi shook her head. "No, Grant. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. What you did was a decision." The sentence landed between them like a door closing. He reached for another explanation, but she had already stepped past him. Downstairs, the chandelier burned above the marble foyer, bright and useless. Naomi walked out with one suitcase, one Bible, and more dignity than the entire mansion could hold. Naomi spent her first night away from the Whitaker estate in Aunt Celeste's guest room, beneath a handmade quilt stitched in squares of blue, cream, and faded gold. The room was small enough for her to hear the old house breathing around her, the pipes clicking softly in the walls, the ceiling fan turning in a slow circle above her, the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere down the block. It was not luxury. It was shelter. And for the first time in years, no marble hallway waited outside her door, no silent staircase, no husband coming home late with explanations polished smoother than truth. She lay awake until dawn with her Bible on the nightstand and her bare hand resting over her heart, listening to the quiet and learning that peace could feel unfamiliar before it felt safe. By morning, Grant had sent flowers. White roses. 24, arranged in a crystal vase so expensive that Aunt Celeste stared at the delivery man as if he had brought a chandelier to a kitchen table. The card was brief. "Come home. We need to talk." Naomi read it once, then set it beside the vase. Aunt Celeste poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs and asked, "What do you want to do with those?" Naomi looked at the roses. They were beautiful, but beauty had never been the problem. Grant knew how to buy beautiful things. He knew how to place them in front of pain and hope they distracted from the wound. Naomi lifted the vase carefully, carried it to the front porch, and handed it to Mrs. Alvarez next door, whose husband had passed the previous winter and who still sat alone by her window every Sunday afternoon. "For your table," Naomi said gently. The older woman pressed a hand to her chest, touched beyond words. That was when Naomi understood something simple and permanent. Love that arrives too late does not have to be wasted, but it does not have to be accepted as an apology either. At 10 a.m., she met with Elaine Porter, a family attorney recommended by Pastor Raymond. Elaine's office was on the second floor of a restored brick building downtown, above a bookstore that smelled of paper and rain. Elaine was in her 50s, silver-haired, calm-eyed, and precise in the way women become when life has taught them the cost of being underestimated. She listened without interruption as Naomi described the church, the ring, the estate, the years of public smiles and private loneliness. When Naomi finished, Elaine closed her folder and said, "You do not have to prove you suffered loudly for your pain to be real." Naomi exhaled, and something in her shoulders finally lowered. They discussed separation, assets, privacy, and the foundation accounts Naomi had managed for years without taking a salary. Grant's lawyers would expect a fight over money, Elaine explained. They would be prepared for anger. They would not be prepared for clarity. Naomi nodded. She did not want revenge that made her resemble the people who had wounded her. She wanted legal protection. She wanted her name separated from Grant's choices. She wanted the small scholarship fund she had built through the church to remain untouched by scandal. Most of all, she wanted to leave clean. Not empty, clean. While Naomi signed the first papers, Grant sat in a conference room at Whitaker Holdings, surrounded by men paid to soften consequences. His public relations director advised a statement about marital privacy. His chief financial officer warned that donors were already calling about the Grace Covenant incident. Marissa sat near the window, scrolling through her phone, irritation flickering across her face each time Naomi's name appeared in another quiet message of support online. "She is making you look guilty by saying nothing," Marissa said. Grant looked up slowly. The sentence bothered him because it was true, and because for the first time, he heard the smallness in it. Naomi had not called reporters. Naomi had not posted a single word. Naomi had not asked anyone to choose sides. Yet her silence had exposed him more completely than accusation ever could. That evening, Grant drove to Aunt Celeste's house alone. No driver. No assistant. No prepared statement. Naomi saw his headlights through the curtain before he knocked. Aunt Celeste looked at her, but Naomi only stood, smoothed her sweater, and opened the door. Grant looked misplaced on the narrow porch, too polished for the peeling blue paint, too powerful for a house where power meant bringing soup when someone was sick. "Please," he said, "just come outside for 5 minutes." Naomi stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind her. The air smelled of magnolia and summer rain. Grant's face softened when he saw her, as if he expected the old tenderness to rise automatically. It did not. "I never meant for it to happen that way," he said. Naomi held his gaze. "But you meant for it to happen." He looked away. There it was again. Truth, plain and undecorated. "I was confused," he said. "I was under pressure. Marissa became someone I could talk to." Naomi's voice remained quiet. "You had a wife you could talk to. You wanted someone who admired you without asking you to be honorable." The words did not cut because they were cruel. They cut because they were accurate. Grant's eyes shone with something close to fear. "What do you want from me?" Naomi looked past him toward the street, where porch lights glowed one by one in ordinary homes filled with ordinary people trying to love each other decently. "Respect," she said. "But since you could not give it while I was your wife, you will give it while I become your past." She stepped back inside before he could answer. And on the porch of a small blue house, Grant Whitaker finally understood that Naomi was not waiting to be won back. She was already walking forward. By the end of the week, the Whitaker estate had become a museum of Naomi's absence. Her closet still held rows of silk gowns she had never truly loved, arranged by color under soft lights like evidence of a life Grant had mistaken for devotion. Her vanity still carried a silver hairpin, a small bottle of lavender oil, and a prayer card tucked beneath the mirror. In the breakfast room, her chair remained pulled slightly away from the table, the way she always left it when she rose early to visit the women's shelter or deliver sheet music to the church office. Nothing had moved, yet everything had changed. Grant discovered that emptiness had a sound. It was the echo of his shoes across the marble foyer. It was the refrigerator humming in a kitchen where Naomi no longer asked the staff about their children. It was the grand piano sitting open in the music room, waiting for hands that would not return. He tried to work from home, but numbers blurred on his laptop. Contracts sat unsigned. Calls from investors stacked up like weather warnings. For years, Naomi had softened the edges of his world without ever asking for credit. She remembered birthdays, wrote condolence notes, hosted charity breakfasts, and noticed when a quiet employee needed help but was too proud to ask. Grant had thought those things were small because they did not appear on financial statements. Now, one by one, those small things began disappearing, and with them went the warmth that had made his empire look human. Marissa arrived on Thursday afternoon wearing oversized sunglasses and a pale linen suit, carrying the confidence of a woman who believed entering a mansion meant becoming its mistress in every meaning that mattered. She walked through the foyer slowly, touching the banister, admiring the chandelier, studying the family portraits as if deciding which ones would have to be removed. The housekeeper, Mrs. Donnelly, greeted her with professional politeness and nothing more. That nothing more irritated Marissa. "You may put my things in the primary suite," she said, handing over a designer overnight bag. Mrs. Donnelly did not take it. "That room belongs to Mrs. Whitaker until Mr. Whitaker gives me different instructions." Marissa's smile tightened. Mrs. Whitaker left. Mrs. Donnelly looked at her with the calm of a woman who had served powerful families long enough to know the difference between money and class. Leaving a house is not the same as losing her name. Grant heard the exchange from the study and did not intervene. Shame, quiet and unwelcome, moved through him. A month earlier, he might have corrected the staff. He might have defended Marissa, for the sake of pride. But now, every attempt to replace Naomi sounded vulgar before it was even spoken. At dinner, Marissa sat across from him at the long mahogany table where Naomi used to place fresh flowers from the garden. Never expensive arrangements, just magnolias, gardenias, sometimes wild jasmine in a blue glass vase. Tonight, the table held a cold centerpiece chosen by a decorator and food neither of them wanted. Marissa talked about managing the narrative, about making their relationship look mature, modern, inevitable. Grant listened, but his eyes drifted to the empty chair beside him. He remembered Naomi laughing there during their first Thanksgiving in the house, wearing an apron over a velvet dress because she insisted on helping in the kitchen even though the chef begged her not to. He remembered the way she bowed her head before meals, not dramatically, just briefly, as if gratitude was a private conversation. "Are you even listening to me?" Marissa asked. Grant looked back at her. The candlelight made her beautiful in the polished way magazines understood beauty, but there was no tenderness in the room. No shelter. No forgiveness. Only strategy. "You said we should release a statement," he replied. "We should," she said. "And you should stop letting Naomi's silence make you look like the villain." Grant set down his fork. "Maybe I look like the villain because I behaved like one." The words surprised both of them. Marissa's face changed first into disbelief, then annoyance. "You are not seriously letting her turn you against me." Grant leaned back, suddenly exhausted. "Naomi did not turn me against anyone." She walked away. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows, blurring the harbor lights in the distance. Somewhere in North Charleston, Naomi was likely sitting at Aunt Celeste's kitchen table, drinking tea from a chipped mug, surrounded by peace he had not known how to value. The thought struck him harder than any headline could have. He had filled Naomi's life with luxury, but Aunt Celeste's small blue house had given her something he had failed to protect: safety. Later that night, Grant walked into the music room alone. The piano bench creaked beneath him as he sat. He touched one key, and the single note rose into the silence, thin and aching. On the music stand, he found Naomi's handwritten markings for the children's choir. At the top of the page, she had written, "Sing gently. Someone listening may be healing." Grant closed his eyes. For the first time, he understood that Naomi had spent years helping others heal while quietly breaking in his house. And the mansion, with all its glass and gold, had never looked poorer. 3 weeks after leaving the Whitaker estate, Naomi signed a lease for a narrow brick storefront on a quiet street in North Charleston, between a family-owned bakery and a second-hand bookstore with sun-faded novels in the window. The place had once been a small insurance office, and it still smelled faintly of old carpet, dust, and coffee. The walls were beige, the ceiling fan clicked unevenly, and the front door stuck unless she lifted the handle at just the right angle. It was nothing like the polished ballrooms where she had once stood beside Grant, while donors praised their generosity over champagne. It was better. It was hers. Aunt Celeste arrived the first Saturday morning with a toolbox, 2 folding chairs, and a radio that only played gospel when it felt like cooperating. Pastor Raymond sent a church volunteer to help paint the walls a soft shade of blue. Mrs. Alvarez brought homemade empanadas wrapped in foil. 3 former students from Naomi's children's choir showed up with rollers, paper towels, and the bright, serious energy of teenagers who wanted to be useful. Naomi stood in the center of the room wearing jeans, sneakers, and an old Howard University sweatshirt, her curls tied back, her hands marked with paint. For the first time since that Sunday, she smiled without effort. On the front window, she taped a printed sign, "The Once Prayer Foundation." Beneath it, in smaller letters, she had written, "Music, mentoring, and emergency support for women and children rebuilding with dignity." She had chosen the name carefully, not because she wanted the world to remember her humiliation, but because she wanted other women to know that one honest prayer could become a doorway. It did not have to be dramatic. It did not have to be understood by everyone. It only had to be brave. The first donation came from a retired nurse who had heard about Naomi through Grace Covenant and mailed a check for $50 with a note that said, "Someone helped me leave with my children in 1988. I never forgot." Naomi read the note twice, then placed it in a shoebox she labeled "Reasons to Keep Going." By the end of the month, the shoebox was half full. Letters came from women in Savannah, Atlanta, Charlotte, and small towns Naomi had never visited. Some wrote about marriages that had gone cold. Some wrote about being dismissed, belittled, or made invisible in beautiful homes. Others simply wrote, "I thought I was the only one." Naomi answered every letter she could. She never gave advice she was not qualified to give. She referred women to licensed counselors, legal aid offices, shelters, and churches with verified support programs. She learned the language of boundaries, trauma recovery, financial planning, and safe transition. Her kindness became organized. Her pain became practical. Every Tuesday evening, she taught music to children whose parents could not afford lessons. Every Thursday morning, She hosted a dignity circle for women rebuilding their lives, where no one had to share more than they wanted, and no one was asked why they stayed so long. That rule mattered to Naomi. Shame had kept too many people silent. She would not let healing begin with interrogation. One rainy afternoon, a young mother named Denise arrived with a little girl in pink rain boots and a folder of unpaid bills pressed to her chest. Denise apologized for crying before she had even sat down. Naomi handed her tissues, warm tea, and time. Not pity. Time. As Denise spoke, Naomi saw a version of herself from months earlier, trying to make pain sound reasonable so no one would judge her for having endured it. When the little girl wandered toward the old, upright piano donated by the bookstore owner, Naomi invited her to press a key. The note rang out, clear and bright, and the child laughed. Denise covered her mouth as tears slipped down her face. I forgot. She could still laugh, she whispered. Naomi placed a gentle hand over hers. Then we will start there. Meanwhile, Grant watched Naomi's new life from a distance he had no right to cross. Her foundation was mentioned in a local newspaper, then on a Charleston morning show, then by a national nonprofit that praised her model of combining emotional recovery with practical resources. Reporters requested interviews. Naomi accepted only the ones focused on the work, never the scandal. When asked about her marriage, she said, "My private pain is not the center of this mission. The women rebuilding their lives are." Grant heard the clip in his office and sat very still. There was no bitterness in her voice. That was what undid him. Bitterness would have allowed him to feel accused. Naomi's peace left him alone with himself. One evening, long after his staff had gone, Grant opened the Whitaker Foundation account reports and saw how many community programs Naomi had quietly kept alive over the years. Scholarship renewals, grocery grants, medical transportation vouchers, music supplies for public schools within 20 miles. Her name was not on most of them. His was. The realization burned without flames. Naomi had not only loved him, she had made his wealth useful. He had offered her diamonds, but she had taught his money how to serve. Across town, Naomi locked the storefront after a long day and stood under the small awning as rain silvered the street. Inside, the blue walls glowed softly through the window. A child's drawing of a woman holding a lantern hung near the door. At the bottom, in uneven crayon letters, someone had written, "Miss Naomi helps people find the light." Naomi touched the glass with her fingertips, and this time when tears came, they did not taste like loss. They tasted like return. She had walked out of a church with one prayer and an empty hand. Now that same hand was opening doors for others. 1 year after Naomi taped that first paper sign to the storefront window, the Once Prayer Foundation hosted its annual benefit at the Charleston Civic Hall, a restored building with high arched windows, polished wood floors, and enough history in its walls to make every footstep feel remembered. Outside, the evening air smelled of salt water and rain, and the city lights shimmered along the streets like small promises. Inside, round tables were dressed in ivory linen, but there were no ice sculptures, no velvet ropes, no guests ranked by wealth or last name. Naomi had insisted on that. Teachers sat beside attorneys. Nurses sat beside business owners. Women who had once arrived at her office with trembling hands now welcomed donors at the registration table with steady smiles. Children from her music program tuned violins near the stage, their nervous laughter rising above the soft clink of glasses. This was not the kind of gala Grant Whitaker had taught her to survive. This was the kind of room she had learned to build. Naomi stood backstage in a deep blue dress with long sleeves and a neckline modest enough for church, but elegant enough for the cameras. The fabric moved softly when she breathed, catching the light like evening water. Aunt Celeste adjusted the pearl clip in Naomi's curls, the same one her mother had worn years ago, then stepped back with mist in her eyes. "Look at you," she whispered. Naomi smiled. "Still me." Aunt Celeste touched her cheek. "More you than ever." Across the hall, Grant entered quietly through a side door, wearing a black suit and no expression that belonged to power. He had almost stayed away. The invitation had come through the Whitaker Foundation office, addressed formally to Mr. Grant Whitaker, and for 3 days it sat unopened on his desk. In the past year, his hotels had survived, but his image had not remained untouched. 2 board members resigned from his charitable trust. A university delayed naming a building after him. Donors who once smiled at his table began asking harder questions about the difference between giving money and living with integrity. Marissa had left before autumn, taking her ambition to another man with cleaner headlines. Grant did not chase her. By then, he had begun to understand that what he had called passion had mostly been vanity wearing perfume. Now he stood near the back wall of the Civic Hall, unseen by most people, watching a room glow around. The woman he had once treated like an accessory to his success. Naomi stepped onto the stage, and the applause rose before she reached the podium. It did not sound like politeness. It sounded like gratitude. Grant saw Denise in the front row, the young mother Naomi had helped, sitting beside her daughter in pink hair bows. He saw Pastor Raymond wiping his glasses. He saw Mrs. Alvarez holding a program against her heart. And he saw Naomi, not as his wife, not as the woman he had lost, but as someone he had never fully understood. She waited until the room settled. When people talk about rebuilding, she began, her voice clear and warm. They often imagine something dramatic. A new house, a new job, a new name. But sometimes rebuilding begins with one safe chair, one honest conversation, one person who believes you without making you prove your pain. The hall grew still. Naomi spoke about dignity without making it sound expensive. She spoke about faith without using it to shame anyone. She spoke about love as responsibility, not performance. She thanked counselors, legal aid volunteers, school teachers, church kitchens, and neighbors who had given quietly when no camera was near. She did not mention Grant. She did not need to. Every word carried the shape of what he had failed to be. Then the children's choir came forward, 30 small voices arranged beneath the amber stage lights. Naomi turned toward them, and her face changed with the tenderness Grant remembered from years ago, except now it did not belong to him. It belonged to a room full of people who had earned it through honesty. The music began softly, a hymn, simple and familiar. The same hymn the choir had tried to sing that Sunday morning when Naomi walked out of Grace Covenant with no ring on her hand. Grant felt the breath leave him. He looked down, unable to watch for a moment, but the children's voices found him anyway, crossing the hall with a grace he did not deserve. When the song ended, the room stood. Not for wealth, not for scandal, not for a last name. For Naomi. She looked out over the audience, and for one brief second, her eyes met Grant's near the back wall. There was no shock in her expression, no anger, no invitation, only peace. She gave the smallest nod, the kind one gives to a stranger whose humanity they still recognize, then turned back to the children beside her. Grant understood then that forgiveness could be present in a room and still not reopen a door. The applause continued around him, full and bright, while he stood alone in the shadowed back of the hall, finally seeing what the whole city had already learned. Naomi Whitaker had not risen to make him regret losing her. She had risen because the world needed what he had failed to honor. After the benefit ended, the Charleston Civic Hall emptied slowly, as if people were reluctant to leave the warmth Naomi had gathered under one roof. Volunteers folded linens. Children carried violin cases half their size. Women hugged each other near the registration table with the careful tenderness of people who understood survival did not always look dramatic from the outside. Naomi stood near the stage, thanking donors by name, remembering details no assistant had written down for her. She asked one teacher about her classroom library. She asked a counselor about her new office space. She knelt to compliment Denise's daughter on the pink ribbon tied around her wrist. Every gesture was small. Every gesture was sincere. Grant watched from the edge of the room until the crowd thinned and the lights softened from celebration to cleanup. Twice, he turned toward the exit. Twice, he stopped. He had given speeches to investors in London, negotiated hotel acquisitions in Dubai, and faced rooms filled with men waiting for him to fail. None of that had prepared him to walk across a nearly empty hall and speak honestly to the woman whose trust he had treated like something replaceable. When Naomi finally stepped away from the last group of volunteers, Grant approached with both hands visible, empty, respectful. He did not say her name immediately. He waited until she saw him. Naomi turned, calm but not surprised, a program booklet resting lightly in her hand. For a moment, the only sound between them was the distant scrape of chairs being stacked. "You did something beautiful tonight," Grant said. The compliment sounded too small for what he meant, but it was the only honest sentence he could find. Naomi nodded. A lot of people did. He accepted the correction without defense. Yes, they did. Silence settled. But it was not the old silence from their mansion, heavy with avoidance. This one had edges. This one demanded truth. Grant looked at the stage where the children had sung, then back at her. I came to apologize without asking for anything. Naomi studied his face, and he knew she was searching for the performance, the public version of regret that could be polished into redemption. He let her search. There was nothing polished left. I humiliated you, he said. Not because I was confused. Not because I was lonely. Because I was selfish, and I thought your grace would protect me from consequences. Naomi's fingers tightened once around the program, then relaxed. Grant continued, his voice lower. I brought another woman into a sacred place and expected you to carry the shame quietly so I could keep my image clean. I have replayed that morning more times than I can count, and every time, the worst part is not that you left. The worst part is that I gave you every reason to. The hall seemed to grow still around them. Naomi looked toward the stained wood floor, then back to him. Why are you telling me this now, she asked. Because I should have said it before I lost the right to be heard. That answer reached her, not enough to reopen anything, but enough to be recognized as truth. Grant took a breath. I signed the final settlement papers this morning. No delays. No conditions. The scholarship fund remains fully yours. The estate staff will receive the retirement protections you requested. And the Whitaker Foundation will continue funding your legal aid partners for 5 years, anonymously if you prefer. Naomi's eyes changed at that, not with affection, but with careful attention. Do not make charity a bridge back to me. I will not, he said quickly. That is not why I am doing it. She waited. Grant looked down at his hands, the hands that had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars and still had not known how to hold a marriage. With honor. I am doing it because you made my wealth useful before I understood what usefulness meant. I cannot undo what I did, but I can stop needing credit for doing what should have been done in the first place. For the first time, Naomi's expression softened, though it remained guarded by wisdom. That is a start, Grant. But a start is not the same as restoration. The words were gentle, and because they were gentle, they hurt more cleanly. He nodded. I know. Then came the question he had promised himself he would not ask. But grief made a weak man of pride. Is there any part of you that ever thinks about us before everything went wrong? Naomi looked toward the empty chairs, toward the stage lights cooling above the choir risers, toward a life that had once been built around believing he would choose her with the same certainty that she had chosen him. Of course, she said. I would not have grieved if I had not loved you. Grant closed his eyes for half a second. The mercy in that sentence nearly broke him. But grief is not a doorway, Naomi continued, and memory is not a promise. He opened his eyes. She stood before him not cold, not cruel, not victorious. Free. I forgive you, she said. Not because what you did was small, but because I refused to carry it forever. But forgiveness is not permission to return to the place where I had to disappear to be loved badly. Grant absorbed the words like a sentence handed down without anger. Final. Fair. Naomi extended her hand. He looked at it, startled by the grace of the gesture, then shook it gently, as one adult honoring another. Her hand was warm, steady, without the ring he had once believed would always be there. When she released him, something inside Grant released too, not hope, but the illusion that love could be reclaimed by regret alone. Naomi picked up her purse from a nearby chair and turned toward Aunt Celeste, who waited by the exit beneath the soft gold lobby lights. Before leaving, Naomi paused and looked back once. Become someone who does the right thing when no one is watching, she said. That will matter more than being forgiven by me. Then she walked away, not as a woman, escaping pain this time, but as a woman choosing peace with open eyes. Grant remained in the nearly empty hall while volunteers turned off the last row of lights. One by one, the room dimmed around him. For the first time in his life, darkness did not feel like punishment. It felt like a quiet place where a man might finally begin telling himself the truth. 2 years later, Grace Covenant Church opened its doors on a bright April morning for the Naomi Whitaker Community Scholarship Ceremony, and the same stained glass windows that had once watched her leave in silence now poured color across a room filled with children, teachers, volunteers, and families who had come because her pain had grown into something useful. The church looked the same from the outside, Old brick warmed by Carolina sunlight, white steps swept clean, oak doors polished by a century of hands. But Naomi was not the same woman who had walked down that aisle with an empty finger and a breaking heart. She arrived in a soft ivory dress beneath a light blue coat, her curls gathered with her mother's pearl clip, her Bible tucked under one arm, and a folder of scholarship letters under the other. Aunt Celeste walked beside her, slower now, but still sharp-eyed, proud in a lavender suit and white gloves. Pastor Raymond met them at the entrance with a smile that trembled at the edges. "Welcome home," he said. Naomi looked past him into the sanctuary, where the front pew waited beneath the morning light. For a brief moment, memory touched her shoulder. The ring on the Bible, the hymn, the whispers, the door opening behind her as if the whole room had forgotten how to breathe. Then Denise's daughter ran toward her in patent leather shoes, waving a program in the air, and the past stepped back where it belonged. "Miss Naomi, I got the solo," the little girl announced. Naomi knelt carefully, smoothing the child's ribbon. "Then this church is very blessed today." The ceremony began with music, not speeches. Children from the foundation stood where the choir had stood years before, their voices rising clear and bright into the rafters. Parents wiped their eyes. Teachers held hands. Volunteers smiled through tears they did not bother hiding. Naomi sat in the front row, not as a wife being watched, but as a woman being honored for the doors she had opened. Near the back of the church, Grant Whitaker sat alone. His hair had more silver now, and the proud sharpness in his face had softened into something quieter. He had come without photographers, without staff, without any seat reserved in his name. For more than a year, he had funded transportation grants, legal aid clinics, and music scholarships through anonymous channels, never asking Naomi to know, never allowing his company to advertise it. But Naomi did know. Elaine Porter had told her after confirming the funds came with no conditions. Naomi had said only, "Then let the help reach the people who need it." She had not mistaken accountability for love. She had not mistaken generosity for restoration. She had simply allowed a changed action to do its work without turning it into a personal debt. When Pastor Raymond called her to the pulpit, the sanctuary stood. Naomi walked slowly, feeling the wooden floor beneath her feet, each step carrying a different meaning than it had 2 years earlier. At the lectern, she looked over the faces before her, then down to the place on the front pew where she had once left her ring. Sunlight rested there now, pure and untroubled. "This scholarship was born from a simple belief," she said. "No child should lose a future because the adults around them are struggling to survive the present. And no woman should have to choose between dignity and safety, between faith and freedom, between being loved and being respected." Her voice did not shake. It carried. She spoke of education as a bridge, of community as a responsibility, of faith as something that should lift the wounded rather than silence them. She thanked the donors without naming them. She thanked the volunteers who answered calls after midnight. She thanked the mothers who rebuilt their lives while still packing school lunches, filling out job applications, and showing up for their children with tired eyes and brave smiles. Grant listened from the back pew with his head bowed. There was no dramatic collapse, no public confession, no demand for a second chance. Only a man hearing, perhaps fully for the first time, what love sounded like when it was no longer centered on him. After the final scholarship was awarded, Denise's daughter sang her solo. Her voice was small at first, then stronger, carrying the same hymn that had once followed Naomi out of the church. This time, Naomi stayed until the last note faded. When the ceremony ended, families gathered around her with flowers, cards, and photographs. Grant waited until the crowd thinned, then approached no closer than the end of the pew. Naomi saw him and gave a gentle nod. "Thank you for helping them," she said. Grant's eyes lowered. "Thank you for letting it help." That was all. No old promises. No reopen wound. Just two people standing in the place where one had failed and the other had risen, finally honest enough not to confuse peace with reunion. Naomi stepped outside into the April light, where children were laughing on the church lawn and Aunt Celeste was telling someone exactly how much sugar belonged in proper sweet tea. The air smelled of magnolia, warm brick, and new beginnings. Naomi looked at her bare left hand, then lifted it into the sunlight, not empty anymore, but free. Her story taught everyone who heard it that love without respect becomes a beautiful prison, and faith was never meant to lock anyone inside pain. Forgiveness can release the heart without rebuilding the relationship. Dignity is not pride. It is the quiet understanding that every human being deserves to be honored, not hidden, cherished, not used, and protected, not humiliated. Naomi did not win by making Grant suffer. She won by refusing to let suffering make her cruel. She turned one broken morning into shelter for others. And in doing so, she proved that the strongest prayers are sometimes the ones that give us courage to leave, heal, and become a light for someone else.